Welcome. My name is John Powers. I'm the Assistant Director of the Science, Technology, and Society program here at VCU. First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, for braving all the sort of bad weather yesterday and the wind today and so forth. So thank you for coming. I especially would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Heidi Voskuhl, who through 3 or 4 delayed flights and spending most of yesterday at the Philadelphia airport, managed to make it here relatively on time, I would say. Certainly by airline standards, this is on time. So thank you so much for going above and beyond the call of duty, for your perseverance and patience so that you could be here with us today. This is the second event of the spring 2016 STS lecture series called Seeing Machines, Humans and Technology. For this speaker series, I'd like to thank the College of Humanities and Sciences, especially the Interim Dean of Humanities and Sciences, Dr. Allison Baskey. I'd also like to thank the VCU Department of History and the Chair of the Department of History, Dr. John Kneebone. I'd also like to thank our community partners, especially the community idea stations and their liaison with us, Ms. Debbie Mickle, and the Virginia Science Pub, organized by the intrepid Cynthia Gibbs, who is here with us in the back. While I'm talking about the Science Pub, I would also like to inform or remind all of you that Dr. Voskuhl will be giving a Science Pub today on some of her earlier work on the history of androids. It should be interesting. That event will be held at the Camel, which is, I think I have the address somewhere, 1621 West Broad Street. The door opens at 5:30. The event will begin at 6 o'clock. It should be interesting, and so you're welcome to attend that as well. Dr. Voskuhl comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania. She is an associate professor at the Department of History and Sociology of Science. Her first book, which I have a copy of here, as I alluded to, is about androids. It's called Androids in the Enlightenment, Mechanics, Artisans, and Cultures of the Self. It was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2013. It's a very fascinating work about clockwork humans and the sort of interactions between the artisans and wealthy aristocrats who commission these kind of works. And actually at the cover of the book, I'll leave it up here so you can take a look, is actually an automaton, a woman who was playing a dulcimer, and the thing would actually play. It had a clockwork mechanism inside and was seen as an object of art, but also a curiosity as well. So if you come to the Science Pub tonight, you'll be hearing more about that. Dr. Voskuhl's new project is about the Second Industrial Revolution. And what she does is look at the emergence of engineering as a profession, and engineers as a group of people who kind of try to make their work in society have some kind of social meaning. I guess that is... that's what it's about. She'll tell you more about it. Her talk today is called Engineering Philosophy, Machine Culture, and Social Elites in the Second Industrial Revolution, 1900 to 1930. So it is my very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Heidi Voskuhl.
Do you have the laser pointer by any chance?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you, John, so much. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for your patience. There were 3 moments in the last 20 hours when I got very, very close to canceling this trip. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to everyone who made this possible. Still quite after I finished the book on the androids, I'm still quite at the beginning of this new project. That's at least how it feels. And as Dr. Powers said, I look on the one hand at the machine culture of the Second Industrial Revolution and how engineers first emerged as a social and professional group right then, And on the other hand, I look at the increasing interest that some engineers had at that same time in philosophy. They were interested in reading and writing philosophical texts. I'll talk mostly about German engineers and Germany today, but in the long run, I'm actually planning this project to be a transatlantic project about dialogues and migration and exchange between German and US American engineers. And I'll say a bit more about that at the end of my talk. We know quite a bit about the constitution of engineers as a professional group, both in Western Europe and in the US. That was between 1870 and 1930. When they constituted themselves as a social group that began with the education of technicians at a wide range of schools and polytechnics during the Industrial Revolution. In the later 19th century, in particular in Germany, many of these schools went through successful reforms, and they were transformed into what was then called technical universities, places like MIT or Caltech or Virginia Tech for that matter. Engineering societies were founded, both in the US and in Germany. Civil engineers, for example, in 1871, miners in 1880, electrical engineers in 1893. And these associations became very effective mouthpieces for the social and for the technical agendas of engineers. The year 1899 was particularly successful in Germany for technical universities because they received from the emperor himself the right to grant PhD degrees in engineering. And in formal terms, this made them fully equal institutions of learning. It made them on par with traditional universities, and which were powerful institutions. So that was a big deal in 1899, and engineers continued, because the reason for that was because engineers continued to be frowned upon by the humanistically trained bourgeois dignitaries as mere mechanics. That is what people trained in theology or in Greek and Latin called engineers. They said that engineers were lacking education, culture, and lifestyle. So among those who expressed such hierarchies of people and hierarchies of knowledge, were the so-called poet engineers. One of them was a guy called Max Maria von Weber, who happens to be the oldest son of Karl Maria von Weber, who happens to be the inventor of romantic opera. He was one of the poet engineers. He obviously came from a quintessential cultured family, but he was also trained as an engineer, which was unusual at the time, and worked as a railway engine driver. Later in his life, he wrote literary texts and popular essays. One of them is called The Status of German Technicians in Political and Social Life. And this is what in this work he says about engineers. He says that engineers are parvenus. He says that they are parvenus, and one of them is the estate of the engineers. He says that the traditional estates somehow don't know how to integrate them into their ranks. Professors at universities, that would be us, consider them as interlopers. And for governments, engineers are an inconvenient new element in the mechanism of the state. Everyone feels bothered by their increasing relevance. That's what Weber says. Everyone calls them, at least deep down, a necessary evil. Now, one of the things that are conspicuous here, apart from the outspoken marginalization of engineers, is the use of the term estate. It was used by engineers and by educated, humanistically trained people and others in Germany until way into the 20th century, even though the term estate actually originally describes the social stratification of European societies before industrialization. There had been a long-lasting pattern of dividing labor and dividing professions that had emerged in the High Middle Ages, in the feudal system. A division into land-owning nobility, for example, privileged knights, dependent peasants, clergy, and merchants. And there were laws, secular laws and church laws, that made this division stable over centuries. It gave rise to very solid rules of conduct, codes of honor, marriage and dress conventions, and laws for property ownership. And these groups, with very different legal status and codes of conduct, mostly in the French and German-speaking early modern worlds, these groups were called estates. But as a memory and as a rhetorical tool, This tradition of the estates remained alive and powerful for the formation of modern professional identities until way into the industrial and even post-industrial ages. Many of the actual laws of the estate society were still valid and operating even after the First World War. And it was not least the humanistically trained German bourgeois elites, those with whom engineers were competing. They claimed for themselves a rightful place in the time-honored tradition of the estate society. They used it to distinguish themselves from the new industrial order, the new industrial mass culture, and the engineers who were designing it. What made the situation even more complicated for engineers was their own ambivalence about this estate ethos of the educated civil servants of the German state. Many engineers were very ready and prepared to appropriate the role model of a cultured, educated bourgeois male as their own, but by no means all of them did. Now, there was a group of engineers and of philosophers at the time who were engaged in formulating social and political theories of technology. And I'm interested specifically in them in relation to this conflict of class and social status. Particularly important in this regard was an association for German engineers, specifically with university degrees. Was this association? This is actually their periodical. This is the periodical of the Association of German Engineers, and this is the name of the advanced university degrees. So only academically trained engineers would have access to this association. It had been founded in 1909, explicitly as an elite society, exclusively for engineers with advanced university degrees. And that in itself had been a reaction to a class struggle among German engineers. There had been efforts to exclude non-academic engineers from the larger generic Association of German Engineers. And this is their periodical. This is the older, larger society. This is the periodical of the Association of German Engineers. This is from 1885. This society, the larger generic one, had already been founded in 1865. So there had been efforts to exclude all non-academic engineers from this society in 1909. These efforts failed, and as a consequence of this, this more elite society broke off and founded a more distinguished elite society for engineers specifically with university degrees. Now, there was a man named Karl Weihe who edited this periodical, the periodical of the Elite Association, there we go, from 1921 to 1928. It was called Technology and Culture, Technik und Kultur. This is the front page of an issue from 1925. And the editor, this will be the Schriftführer, is our friend Karl Weihe here, who was pursuing a very, very ambitious agenda of making engineers a social and cultural elite. His project, in particular in the 1920s, from 1921 to 1928, was to make philosophy accessible to engineers and to create a philosophical tradition among engineers. And he thought of the periodical as a mouthpiece for engineers' claims for a higher status in society. So this journal gives us some insight into the overlap of engineers' class struggle for a higher social status and their interest in philosophy. How would these two things converge with each other? From a political viewpoint, it's also important to note that Weihe, the editor, and some of the engineers that were involved with this periodical actively forged connections to philosophers of a group that is now called the Conservative Revolution in the Weimar Republic. The roots of this German conservative movement went all the way back to reactions to the French and the American Revolution. Later in the 19th century, this conservatism, though, became a tradition of mostly militaristic and authoritarian nationalism that rejected various modern principles and phenomena, such as liberalism, socialism, cosmopolitanism, parliamentarism, capitalism, and industrialism. The conservative revolution was most prominent in the 2 decades after the First World War. So that would be the 20s and the early 30s. And its members were some of the best-known journalists, politicians, and philosophers. Many of its members were men born in the last decade of the 19th century, and they experienced the horrors of the First World War directly in the trenches as young soldiers. That left many of them physically and psychologically crippled. At the same time, the literature that they produced often aimed to re-establish this very specific frontline camaraderie of the war. So there was a mystical bond that they had with each other that alienated them at the same time, not only from civilians, but also from other generations, in particular from older generations in Germany who had initiated the war and sent them into this meaningless killing. And in the writing of the history of modern Germany, people particularly emphasize this generational conflict in the 1920s as one of the main sources of the notorious political tensions that would eventually prove fatal for the Weimar Republic and lead to the takeover of political power by the Nazis in 1933. So as I said, among the members of the Conservative Revolution were literary writers, historians, theologians, and philosophers. It's not easy to unify them in this movement under one umbrella, but for some of its members we can say that they made up the most important intellectual movement during the first 3 decades of the 20th century in Germany, who opposed the ideas of democratic parliamentary forms of government and the Republican state form. It was actually Jeffrey Herf, who teaches at the University of Maryland, who did a great deal of groundbreaking work for us on this very complex situation of ideologies, philosophers, and engineers at the time. So Karl Weyer edited this journal from 1921 to 1928. He was one of the most ambitious, most explicit people who said something about the relationship between engineers' social status and their interest and engagement in philosophy. I want to first show you an early example of Weyer's work in this periodical that is explicitly philosophical. And I'll show you one other one in a moment. The early philosophical article comes from 1911, and the title is Affinities in the Ways of Thinking Between Engineers and Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer being a 19th century German philosopher. And in this article, Weyer says at the outset that some people will be surprised to hear the name Schopenhauer, of the philosopher, in connection with the profession of the engineer, which is the most modern of modern professions, and which has assigned itself the task of producing commodities and therefore satisfying people's ever-increasing needs. And Weyer, the author, reminds us that the science of engineering builds on the natural sciences, in particular physics and chemistry, which do not believe in metaphysics, as he says. So how strange is it that a philosopher such as Schopenhauer, how strange must he seem to physics, because Schopenhauer himself not only pursues metaphysics, but he claims a fundamental need of man for metaphysical thinking. Still, Weyer thinks that he can demonstrate that the unique way of Schopenhauer's philosophy has affinities to the ways of thinking that engineers have. And this makes studying Schopenhauer, as Weyer says, attractive to any engineer. What matters to Weyer in Schopenhauer's work is the high valuation of reality, that's what he says, the sharp observation of detail from intuition and from visual impression. He also emphasizes the visual, the intuitive, the immediate, and the concrete. The German word for this is Anschauung and das Anschauliche, which had already been established and developed a complicated system of thought in the early 19th century. The intuitive, the visual, and the immediate is always opposed to abstract terminology, in particular to the terminology of legal thinking. So Weyer says this is what makes Schopenhauer's thinking relevant and interesting for engineers. And Weyer quotes Schopenhauer as saying, I quote, "My sentences are not based on reasoning, but immediately on the visual world itself." End of quote. And a bit later, Weyer quotes Schopenhauer again, saying, "The real inner core of any knowledge is an intuition." End of quote. So Schopenhauer puts less value on mere abstract thinking and reasoning. Those would be people who believe that would be called rationalists, and they believe in rationalism. So Weyer traces how Schopenhauer criticizes philosophers who use reflection and rational reasoning, but not enough intuition. And Weyer celebrates and admires in this text the life and work of Schopenhauer. He says there is this intense reality in it that is gushing to us from Schopenhauer's words. It is indeed, Weyer says, the visual image that is the basis of the engineer's daily work, right? Building machines, drawing, imagining. Engineer's work relies on metaphors, he says, and there is an innate sense of reality in the engineer. And, he says, Schopenhauer, like the engineer, uses examples that are drawn from everyday life, unlike the abstract bureaucrat or the abstract philosopher or the judge or the lawyer. Particularly the philosopher, the bureaucrat, the lawyer, and the judge. These are men whom Weyer dismisses as unworldly, wimpy, or even effeminate. And Weyer laments the absence of imaginative thinking, with images and concrete things. He laments the absence of this in the state administration as well as in legal practice, such as in court. Without this thinking, he says, our modern industrial culture and its complexity cannot be understood. So abstract thinking that only operates with words rather than with images is not sufficient for this world, and it's not sufficient for engineering either. And he says that this is not a struggle between two professions, which I think is actually a way of saying that it is. Instead, Weyer claims that emphasis on thinking with images and concrete things is a necessity by the law of nature. I just want to point your attention to a few other impressions on this page to show you the mix of engineering and of philosophy in this periodical. You have up here, in this corner, for example, you still have residues from the article before that tells you about engineering details, about mass, cogs, gear transmission, forces, velocity, and voltages. Other examples from the same periodical show you a documentation of a massive crankshaft right here in a factory right here. You have advertising, ads on railway and the heavy industry. More of this here. There was more and more advertising as you went into the 1920s in this periodical. But you also have the theme again and again that is the philosophy of technology. This is something that Weyer also wrote himself. It's actually a book review of a book that is called Philosophy of Technology. So Weyer himself contributed to the periodical when he was its editor in the 1920s, and it continued to be such essays and such book reviews, also short announcements and notices in all issues. He was a very committed, very busy, very productive writer. All of these texts that he wrote, short and long, were increasingly, in the 1920s, infused with a mix of conservative, romantic, essentialist, and nationalistic ideas. These ideas were prevalent at the time in Germany. They tried to capture such difficult entities as culture, history, or the German nation state, or indeed the phenomenon of technology. These large ideas were in part legacies from earlier philosophical traditions in Germany in the 19th century. We call these idealist and post-idealist philosophies. And these philosophies often portrayed Germany as a mythical entity that was trailing the other European nation states, such as France and Great Britain, was trailing the other nation states in state building, but Germany had its own pride, and it prided itself in being deeply rooted in a long-standing spiritual and cultural history that reached way back to the equally mystified Middle Ages. This was also mixed up by Weyer with a more recent notion of a struggle for life that was borrowed from popular versions of Charles Darwin's theory of the transmutation of species. These also became part of his account. So you have ideas of struggle, antagonism, selection, and an idea of sudden random change that gets mixed up with the mythical ideas of the German nation state. And that became a way of portraying the new industrial society that Germany, but also the US at the time, were finding themselves in. The class conflicts that came with that. And it also portrayed a way of Germany's place in the larger international order at the time, the very explosive military and diplomatic situations of the late 19th and early 20th century that immediately preceded the outbreak of World War I. These ideas became increasingly aggressive, and they survived the war as well. They became anti-democratic, and they took on antagonistic undertones from about 1900 onwards in Germany, in particular against its European neighbors and its transatlantic neighbor, the United States. So Karl Weiher is the editor of this periodical. He combined in it often these very abstract, very inflated ideas of technology, of history, of the German nation states, and he put them together into very ambitious, often lavishly overcharged stories. He took the Darwinian notion of the struggle for life. This provided a space for gushing celebrations of German industrial technology and was coupled with a belief in progress both in the evolution of man and progress in technology as well. There was ideas of culture and civilization that aimed to distinguish man from animal by invoking his hands, his mind, his consciousness, language, and art, which man only developed, this is what Weiher claims, from a struggle with nature. Now, as a stepping stone for these inflated metaphysical ideas of what man is and what Germany is, Weiher often used a broad narrative history of technology. And it included very typical, almost cliched periods. There's the Stone Age, there's the early civilizations in the Middle East, there are the Greek and the Roman empires. This is a Western civ class, right? There's the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the steam engine, and eventually high industrial civilization. And Weiher invokes these large arcs of history on many occasions, and one can find in his periodical, in particular in his 20s when he was editor, a narrative for pretty much all important technologies: transportation, metalwork, tool building, housing, textiles. There's a narrative for all important technologies and the corresponding narratives that would carry this technology through all key periods in world history. I want to look at one more text by Weiher that illustrates a bit more. This was at the time when he just started the editorship in 1921. And this text outlines most of the claims that he makes and most of the things that he believed in about technology. And these beliefs are so much the basis of his entire agenda of the place of engineers in the social order of Weimar Germany. And Weiher then links his philosophical reflections about technology to his and other engineers' claims for a social recognition as an academic estate, as he says. The text that I look at appeared in 1921, and it was his first regular article as an editor. It has the title, The Age of Technology. It was actually a response to another article that a physicist named Richard von Mises, an Austrian physicist, had written about a year earlier in August of 1920. And von Mises wrote this article in the periodical of the Generic Association for German Engineers. So this is von Mises, an Austrian physicist, and he had been trained as a mechanical engineer, became a professor, for applied mathematics in Berlin at the university in 1920. In 1933, as so many others, he left Germany and eventually became, in 1939, professor of mechanical engineering at Harvard. So he wrote this article in 1920 in the periodical of the Generic Association of German Engineers. It's a popular introduction to the recent breakthroughs in theoretical physics. So if you write in 1920 about theoretical physics, you would most likely write about theories of space-time and the atom by people like Albert Einstein and Max Planck. But Mises not only gives us an introduction to this theoretical, very cutting-edge theoretical physics stuff at the time, but he frames this with two claims about technology, and this is what caught Weier's attention. Mises claims that there has been an age of technology in the recent decades, and he means the so-called second industrial revolution, and he says that this age of technology is fading, and he says also that this technological age will be superseded by a heyday of the speculative natural sciences, physics in particular, that will be comparable to the age of Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler in the early modern period. And it is, of course, these two claims that then Weihe targets in his response. So Mises first acknowledges in his original article that he acknowledges that the industrial age and the artifacts, the factories of the industrial age, have taken up a great deal of space in the consciousness of people. But he refuses to grant this industrial age the same status that the age of humanism would have, like the Renaissance, the age of the Reformation, or the age of the Enlightenment. These periods are the yardstick for him as eras in which key ideas dominated the general consciousness of people. Now, Karl Weihe, the ambitious editor of the new periodical of the elite society, counters these claims, and he says that Mises only sees the exterior and the surface, but not the ideas of engineering that are gushing from engineering work and technology. Weihe is willing to concede that the foundational thoughts of engineering cannot be easily expressed in one word or formula, in the way that, for example, the ideas of humanism. So Weihe, of course, counters this, and he says that Mises only sees the exterior of engineering work and not the ideas that are wrapped up in its interior. Weihe is willing to concede that the foundational thoughts of technology cannot be expressed in one word, like the ideas of humanism or enlightenment, as if the ideas of humanism or enlightenment could be expressed in one idea or formula. It's actually interesting that both Weihe and Mises earlier in the 1920s advocate both this very strangely reductive version of these complex periods in Western intellectual history. Both of them seem to believe that the ideas of the eras of the Reformation, of humanism, or of the Enlightenment can be expressed in a few words, and that they were part of a general consciousness of the time. Such fantasies about the intellectual history of the modern West were shared by many others of the time. We tend to no longer believe in such things. But Weihe wants to talk about engineering ideas, and he says that engineering ideas come forward more and more, and they start merging with the spiritual and the intellectual progress, thank you, John, that humanity is making. Weihe also has other attacks against Mises. He says that any age can be called the age of technology, not just the industrial age. And he finds it problematic that Mises seems to assume that all technology is industrial technology. And on this occasion, Weihe engages once again, often, he does this on many opportunities, he engages once again in one of his regular exercises in the history of technology. He points to the cultural centers of antiquity. He talks about the civil engineering, the hydraulic engineering, and the military engineering in Egypt, Babylonia, and in Rome. And he even reaches to eras of prehistoric man and stilt houses. He says such periods can all be called ages of technology. And in a little appendix to this, it is as if Weihe wants to make technology a little more similar to the ideas of humanism and the Reformation. He emphasizes technology as a product of the human intellect, not merely a system of artifacts, and he insists that the intellectual work that is embodied in technology is capable as any other intellectual work and art of capturing the heart and soul of humans. And as an afterthought to this ambition of what technology is supposed to carry for him in engineering work, in the general history of intellectual work in the modern West, it's an afterthought from another article of his from 1922. This other article is a much more mundane report of the annual meeting of the Elite Engineers Association in Braunschweig, This report captures how Weyer and his friends at the time conceived of the essence of the German nation and the role of the German nation in larger political international orders. This article moves eventually far away from the topic of technology or from the topic of reporting on the annual meeting of academic engineers. It capitalizes instead on distinctly pre-industrial imagery of Germany, and it reveals very nationalistic overtones. This is as he says, 1922. Poor Germany, he says, you suffer great hardship. But one thing is for sure. However much a barbaric enemy on either side of the ocean, there will be on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, sucks us dry and wants to take away from us the last asset, the German bravery and the German spirit that swell from the marvelous old towns of our beautiful fatherland and that ever find nourishment from our culture. These they cannot take away from us. And he means US Americans, the British and the French. Now, engineering emerged in Germany as a profession after important parts of modern society had already constituted themselves, such as the Enlightenment cultured a bourgeois subject, a rational state bureaucracy, a military, a public sphere, a powerful state-funded university system, and also aggressive imperialist nationalism and conservatism. There was nothing unproblematic in the 20s for engineers about integrating themselves into this existing set of modern cultural and political practices and identities. And this is what I assume is why it was so desirable for engineers to claim for themselves in an age of high industrialism a rightful place in a pre-industrial social order, in a medieval and early modern way of social thinking. And that's why it was so desirable for engineers to engage in philosophical and historical activities. Technology and engineering were sitting in very uncomfortable spots in the leading country, which was Germany, of the Second Industrial Revolution. They were not in all, engineering was not at all in any uncomplicated way a part of German culture. I want to say a few more things about Weyer himself and the periodical and the people that ended up clustering around this periodical. So there was this elite academic association of German engineers with university degrees. They had to branch out after they founded themselves in 1909. They had to create for themselves an audience, they had to create influence, and they needed funds, right? Financial resources. Engineers, philosophers, professors, and wealthy factory owners ended up clustering around this periodical and around matters of engineering, philosophy, and social status. One example is an engineering professor named Karl Julius von Bach. He taught in Stuttgart at the Technical University from 1878 until 1922, for a very long time. He was a pioneer in the theoretical foundations of material science, but he was also involved in the social question of the struggle between capital-owning classes and working classes. He became famous through a widely received essay competition that he organized in 1913, just before World War I. And he organized this essay competition through the large generic Association of German Engineers. The essay question was, how can we attenuate the antagonism between the capital-owning and the working classes in Germany? This was widely advertised, a call for papers, as it were. Now, the elite association of academic German engineers approached him soon after they founded themselves in 1909, and they asked him to join them as an exclusive member and donor. This is actually part of a letter here where they say, dear professor, the summer of this year, this was in 1909, the summer of this year we founded this association of exclusively for academically trained engineers. Don't you want to join us and have special membership that comes with special fees, obviously. Another example, important example, is a man named Paul Reusch, who was an industrialist. He had emerged as one of the economically most successful and politically most influential men in Germany in the Weimar Republic. He had been trained as a mining engineer and ended up becoming the director of one of the biggest mining and machine building corporate groups in Germany at the time, just to give you the size. The name of this is Gute Hoffnungshütte, the Good Hope Factory. So in 1920, this is the size of this corporation, of what he was. He was the director of this. This is the Ruhr Valley in Germany. This is where the steel and coal industry was emerging in the second industrial revolution. Now, Reusch became a supporter of the conservative revolution that I mentioned earlier after the First World War. He rejected the democratic system of the Weimar Republic, and he favored more authoritarian ways of governing. So I'm interested in the overlap of people, philosophy, money, engineering, and institutions at this time. And one of the most interesting things about him, about this guy for me, is the long-lasting friendship that he had with a philosopher named Oswald Spengler. Spengler became very prominent in Europe and eventually in the United States as well with the publication of a 2-volume work called The Decline of the West. It was published in 1918, when in fact the whole West seemingly had destroyed itself. The subtitle is Outlines of a Morphology of World History. So he also, like Weyer himself, likes the very metaphysical language of outlining the structures of world history, of civilization, of culture, and of the determination and the vocation of man in history. The concept of morphology included a number of claims that varied a little from person to person. But Spengler himself meant by this ideas about what constituted history, what constituted the course of history, the course that history takes. And he also included theories of life, culture, and civilization into this, as well as theories of technology and theories of the sciences. It's also important to note that Spengler always distinguished himself from institutionally attached scholars at the time. He celebrated his own free intellectual and poetic activity, while he was at the same time complaining all the time about feelings of isolation and loneliness. His intellectual activity, it was existential philosophy, it was theories of history, there's lots of evolutionary theory in that as well. So his work was never meant to be a systematic scholarly activity in any specific discipline. That's not what he wanted to do, let alone based on empiricist inductive reasoning. He always insisted for himself on an intuitive, poetic approach to the world and to thought. So his work figured prominently in the periodical of the Elite Association of German Academic Engineers, and it was in particular his ideas about history, culture, his ideas about mathematics, and his ideas about the machine that these engineers found interesting. Now, Spengler and Reusch, they met in the early 1920s. At the time, Spengler was a regular guest in the national conservative circles of industrialists, of factory owners, and wealthy families in the coal and steel region in Germany. I'll just show you a few of the houses where these people hung out with each other. These were the houses that people lived in. They were often right on the edge of these large industrial corporations, and they housed the CEOs or the entire C-suite of these large corporations. This is also where people socialized, and they socialized among other people with philosophers, such as Oswald Spengler. Spengler himself lived in Munich. He lived of the inheritance of his mother, whom he hated. He was so relieved when she finally died. Spengler and Reusch now developed a regular correspondence and friendship. Reusch kept inviting Spengler for talks, and he supported financially some of Spengler's often obscure and very radical academic projects. Reusch also had asked Spengler to buy art and paintings on his behalf at auctions so that he could furnish his prestigious houses and mansions. He owned several of these houses. Reusch also gave Spengler a loan for buying himself a fairly nice house in Munich. Just want to show you a few pieces of correspondence here. Reusch writes to Spengler, hey, do you want to come to Oberhausen in the Ruhr Valley and give a talk in our Monday Society? That's actually a reference to the so-called Wednesday Society in the 1790s, where people in Prussia discussed Kantian philosophy. This is another letter that Spengler wrote back to Reusch. Yes, I'm going to come and I'm going to talk about Schiller and the political drama, probably for about 3/4 of an hour. And then Spengler writes to Reusch, says, oh, I was about to leave town and then I saw this nice house. It is a ducal kind of thing. It has 8 bedrooms and I need 40,000 for the down payment. Reusch writes back and says, yeah, I'll deposit the money in your usual bank account. And then there's another one. Hey, Spengler says, I was at this auction and I bought a few, as usual, I bought a few paintings for you and I have them framed and then sent to you in the usual way. So Spengler was in charge of cultural purchases for this guy Reusch, who had a lot of money but not enough time to buy paintings for himself. This is a nice telegram that I liked. I'm definitely coming in early April. That's what Spengler is saying. And finally, to give you a sense of how these people were hanging out, Reusch says, dear Mr. Spengler, I'm going to be in Munich. Do you want to have dinner with me in the Regina Hotel? Please wear a black tie. This is what you would need to wear in this hotel. So these connections were not unusual in the 1920s at the time between industrialists, engineers, and philosophers. They spread ideas about a field of study that we now call the philosophy of technology, and they spread these ideas among philosophers, industrialists, and engineers. As I've said before, there was nothing unproblematic at the time about integrating technology and engineering and the Industrial Revolution into existing, well-developed theories and practices of society in Germany. Both philosophers and engineers experienced that the hard way. Modern engineering and modern engineers emerged only after key aspects of modernity had already constituted themselves in Germany. As a response, some engineers and humanistically trained bourgeois men claimed for themselves to be part of a pre-industrial social order. There were others, more radical people, such as Ernst Jünger, who are known for being conservative revolutionaries or even proto-fascists, and they did something else. They radicalized this entire social conflict into a reactionary and a revolutionary theory of technology and society. And it is once again Jeffrey Hoef, who teaches at University of Maryland, who showed how these theories eventually took on proto-fascist elements. I just want to say a few things about the Atlantic space now, about the connection of this to North America and to the New World. It adds another set of questions to this history, and they sharpen some of the historical problems about the role of philosophy and engineers' class conflicts. The efforts of German and American engineers to find a place in their respective societies happened against the background of two very different histories of industrialization, engineering education, and nation-state building. Germany and the US built their nation-state and they built their engineering profession in quite different ways. Engineers in the US also struggled with questions of class and with building a coherent professional identity and an identity as a cultural elite. In the United States, engineers were particularly obsessed with the standard role models of doctors and lawyers. And historians have pointed out repeatedly that the engineer's role in the development of modern America is paradoxical. Engineers played a major role in designing, building, and managing this country, in particular the economic infrastructure, such as transportation, city building, and machine tool building, power transmission, and communication. But engineers often seem to have limited control and visibility in their own work. Tom Hughes takes on this paradox and he emphasizes that Americans see themselves primarily as a democratic people who are dedicated to the doctrines of free enterprise and business. Hughes says that Americans rarely think of themselves as builders, as a people whose most notable achievement for almost 3 centuries has been to transform, he says, a wilderness into a building site. And Hughes concludes, and this is a quote, "A nation of builders," he means the US, "does not know itself. Most of the history it reads and hears instructs otherwise." End of quote. So engineering in the United States was in the 19th century a very individualistic profession, was dominated by independent consultants and shop owners. Right around 1900, this began to change because of the growing scale of corporate organization and the increasing complexity of technology. All of a sudden, there was engineers with salaries popping up who were working for these corporations, and they took center stage. In Europe, at the same time, the state had been the primary patron of engineering throughout the entire 19th century, in particular in France. And American engineering emulated parts of the French model, in particular through its military academies. But the main differences in the organization of American engineering vis-à-vis France and Germany was in the difference of understanding the roles of the state, government, and funding. The first American civilian engineering education programs emerged in separate technical institutes, as I just said, such as the Worcester Institute of Technology, Caltech, or MIT. Because American higher education, as you probably know, was initially dominated by colleges that emphasized the classics, theology or pure science. And that, ironically, again, was a model that Americans had adopted from Germans, an influential model that had been developed in the early 19th century, not least from Renaissance humanism. Now, in regard to this Atlantic space, where engineers, German and American engineers, exchange ideas, where they migrate and where they support each other, I'm trying to learn at the moment from the dynamics of three historical processes. There's immigration, permanent or temporary, between Germany and the US. It's obviously not quite even, but there's a rich migration history in both directions. There are associations of German and American engineers, mostly in the United States. And there are government and private sponsored research trips by American engineers to Germany and by German engineers to the United States. And specifically, in regard to the philosophy of technology, what I'm interested in, I learned from engineers in German-American engineering societies who discussed in their monthly meetings the virtues and the vices of their respective nation states' political and social engineering and security systems. So this would be the periodical of the German-American Technicians Association. They discuss with each other, for example, dirigible airships right here. But they also discuss with each other the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, another very 19th century philosopher who was at the same time someone who wanted to stabilize bourgeois culture, at the same time rebel against it as well. So there was an exchange of ideas in engineering. There's definitely an exchange of ideas in philosophy as well. There was also the American technocracy movement in the 1920s and 1930s. You may have heard of Howard Scott in New York City, who wanted to build a non-democratic system where people in charge would not be elected officials, but experts in science and technology. The idea of political theory and how an industrial nation state should be governed, definitely something about which German and American engineers had a fruitful dialogue with each other about. I also learned from travel, and that's again where our friend Reusch comes in again. He traveled in 1926 to the United States and produced a 117-page report where he talks here about production methods. He talks about Americans' interest in Europe, which according to him was not enough. He also talks about order and cleanliness right here. He also talks about the railway in the US, and he talks about women in the US. So this is a long report that this industrialized who would be able to afford this traveled to the US, who was a sibling in the Second Industrial Revolution, Germany and the United States being the lead nations of the Second Industrial Revolution. This is where we learn about this exchange, migration, and this trade of ideas and support across the Atlantic Ocean at the time. There's also a rich history that is a little better known than the history of engineers about ideas from people like Max Weber and Karl Marx, who were interested in the founding modern disciplines of sociology and economics. And these ideas also traveled very intensely, most notably that young economists in the United States first traveled to Germany to get a PhD there and then build up the discipline of economics here at American universities. And it's the very founding of the disciplines of sociology, as I said, and economics, and even the founding of the discipline of the history of technology, they coincided in this period with my concerns. And ideas about the nature and the threats of modern industrial capitalism took some of their roots here, and they survived way into the American and German counterculture movements in the 20th century, in the form of questions in particular about appropriate technologies and human values in technology. And yet, the German and the American engineers were not very happy. They were participating in the building of very powerful industrial and economic empires around 1900, but they were still finding industrial technology to be a fairly new thing. There were no existing models that would help these engineers to integrate their machine cultures and their knowledge into existing theories and practices of modern society and modern professions. And even though there is now wide agreement nowadays that it is, among other things, the industrial capitalism that makes modern societies modern, this question and the phenomenon of industrial capitalism was something that engineers around 1900 were facing for the first time. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions. Dr. Voskuhl can sort of call on her own people to field questions. If you would, however, wait until Dr. Rader or myself come to you and give you the microphone so we can actually have your question on the video recording. But yeah, so whoever has a question, raise your hand.
Hello. You mentioned in Paul Rausch's report that he had talked about women.
Yes.
I was just curious what he had to say.
Yeah, they were more immense. He targeted the individualism in the United States. That was in particular at the time, but to this day I would say something that Germans notice when they travel to the United States. There is a better developed culture of individualism and the idea that the individual is protected from needs and expectations, say, of the common good or of the state. And he said something like, they are so much more individualistic, which he didn't quite like. Conservatives in Germany, European conservatism would be against individualism. And he said they seem to be more independent, either economically more independent, and they seem to be more active members of the public sphere. And I think there's a raised eyebrow that I can detect in his text there, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned, I think once or twice, that modern engineers really didn't emerge until kind of after some other kind of more modern developments in culture right at the time. Can you be a little bit specific about what exactly, and in that way, kind of what engineers were adapting to once they were formed?
It was both. This is a little more distinct in Western Europe, but it would be similar in the United States as well, because the US industrialized a little later than Britain. So there's a sort of a standard list that one would come up with in order to understand modern society. So there's definitely stratification of our society into certain classes, working classes, bourgeois classes, upper classes. When you have some kind of a legal system that allows property ownership and trade, that didn't really exist in the aristocratic societies. You have something like a public sphere that would usually involve printed stuff that people would read. Nowadays we have digital stuff in our public sphere. People would be able to read in the first place and participate in that. So the legal system itself, where everyone is equal before the law and where the law rules everything, basically. That is also usually a parameter of modern society. The one thing I would single out here, and I wonder if it resonates with your understanding of either European history or American history, would be a confidence as a member of the middle classes that people found. When you study European history, you're a little startled why people like merchants or traders or others who are not land-owning gentry in London, why they would be confident enough to say, we want to participate politically in this whole thing as well. Process usually called emancipation, in a similar way that, say, in the women's movement or the civil rights movement in the 60s, people call for emancipation. So when we talk about the emergence of modern society, we try to be as surprised as we can that it actually emerged in the first place. I find it difficult to square that with American history because the United States was founded right at the time that all of this was happening. So we have here ideas of middle classes and of independence and autonomy once again that maybe seems to exist ever since this place has been founded. If you live in France that had big monarchical states, you might detect a bit more of a tension that this is something that white men had to fight for themselves. And I just want to say one more thing. So there are established middle-class identities. Engineers are new, and they envy these established middle-class identities. And these existing identities, they are not very interested in industrial culture. They're like, oh, we don't like this whole factory thing, and we don't like the engineers who are building it. And I talk a lot with a number of different audiences, including engineering departments, when I present this kind of material, and they say, yes. They say, Heidi, when you present your stuff, it's always so close to home. They feel that there is a marginalization of their expertise vis-a-vis other kinds of expertise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it Carl Weihe? That's how
Weihe, yes.
Weihe.
Weihe.
Okay, so I can't read German, but I noticed he mentioned Spinoza.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know Einstein was a fan of Spinoza's God. I was just curious, did he mention Spinoza a lot, and did he have any influence on Einstein in that regard? Or?
Yes. Yeah, the answer to that is no, and that brings me to the problem of how Weihe actually used philosophy in the first place. If you are a professional historian of philosophy, I think you look for what you are just asking. Some more systematic connections between ideas, commitments to certain ideas, and agreeing and disagreeing with certain schools that are fairly well established. Now, Weihe is not that kind of guy. I can't take him to be a philosopher who makes a little more visible or legible for us certain philosophies. It's a little all over the place. As I said, it's gushing, it's inflated. But he does write, as you say, he does write book reviews. That was a book review, so he could rely on someone else. He's himself not a very good philosopher. And he grabs at random other large, big philosophers' names, ideas, and writes short articles about them. I'm just now chewing on something where two friends of his, I believe, he commissioned them, wrote articles on the philosophy by Immanuel Kant and Johann Gottlieb Fichte, very important German idealism philosophers. And they are so bad, these articles, and a number of things. They're badly motivated. They grab the wrong ideas and present them in the wrong way. So what I'm trying to do, and that's where I am in discussion with historians of philosophy, I do something different here. So he writes bad philosophy. That's fine for me. But he seems to care enough, and maybe that's where Spinoza comes in. He seems to care enough to reach out to something, a canon of philosophy, a little bit of reading, and then mixing it with his own agenda of where engineers belong. So your question, I think, would give him a lot of credit as a philosopher. I think that we can't give him. But he is a political agent, nevertheless, with something that he's trying to do.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about your title, but it also relates to scope and terminology.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what led you to choose the term machine culture and include second technological revolution in your title, and if that has an advantage over the term machine age or mentioning Germany in your title.
Ah, okay. Did I not mention Germany? Okay, no. So don't assume too much agency or deliberation on my part. But yeah, I go back and forth because periodizing the Industrial Revolution is very difficult. So first and second, third and fourth Industrial Revolutions are they're very cliched and they are contested all the time. It's good shorthand for me, Second Industrial Revolution, because it did last, from 1870 to 1930, and the stuff that was being produced was very different from what had been going on in Britain before that. So that is helpful for me. Machine culture, by that I mean the term culture and defining what culture is, what a nation state is, what Germany is, was so important at the time in Germany, and I really apologize that I forgot to mention Germany in the title. Maybe I didn't at the time I devised the title. I didn't realize how much time I would take to just weigh into this German stuff and only wave at the Atlantic Ocean. So that was probably just an oversight on my part. At the moment, I'm not wedded to specific things. I'm just trying to understand what's going on the ground with a fairly small group of engineers. But thanks for your question.
Can I ask a question? I have the mic, so. How many people in this room are engineers or training as engineers? Not that many. Wow, I thought there'd be more. Because there's a lot of engineers in the Honors College for which this lecture counts as credit. Yeah. But I mean, there's so many aspects of the story you're telling are counterintuitive, not the least of which is someone having to do work to establish the credibility of engineers. Yeah. But yet you said that when you give this in engineering schools, they go, "Oh, this sounds really familiar." I mean, it's a little tough because I think of so much of what you hear in popular culture and what we heard Patrick McRae talk about, right? Like the visioneers, the elevation of the engineer, the system thinker, the Tom Hughes, right? Yeah. So it's kind of it's hard for me to imagine that contemporary engineers hear this as something that they hear. But so then, as kind of sub question, you alluded in your remarks that, well, he was sort of trying to say this wasn't about the fight between two cultures, which was the shorthanded way of saying it kind of was. It kind of was, yeah. So do you think maybe that's what engineers hear, like that fight between the humanism versus the technocrat? Or so the questions are related, but answer whatever you want.
The latter part, When you ask me, which engineers do you mean when they hear what?
Say again.
The last part of your question,
when the engineers hear when the engineers hear your talk and they say they understand. Yeah. Do you think maybe what they're hearing in it is this fight between humanists and technocrats?
Yeah, maybe I should qualify what I said. What I said when I present this to engineers, it's at East Coast schools that are not technical universities. I present this material twice at Harvard when I still taught there. Imagine being an engineering professor at Harvard with MIT down the road, and you are at this very elite, extremely old school elite East Coast thing. And you're a professor, and you're not at MIT. I think all these things come together. But you're right, I think in the United States one would have to look for pockets of old school European types. The other place, very similar, is the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where I presented this material, where they didn't allow the first computer. John von Neumann was there with the first computer. They're like, no. Yeah. We want paper and pencil here. Yeah. They are really wedded, but it's definitely an imported model. That's a European colony. Maybe we could think of Harvard for this moment as a European colony as well. So these are the places I would look out for. Very little to do with Silicon Valley. Not yet, anyway. That would be a very different response, and I would love to spend a lot of time just listening to different impressions across generations, ethnic backgrounds and gender. I'm sure there would be a massive panorama of this.
But, which of course is outside the scope of what you're talking about.
So sometime in the future, I think at the moment what I'm interested in is the origins of this field of philosophy of technology. Yeah. So it's necessarily rather narrow. But I'm always willing, I concede immediately when people say it doesn't resonate with my intuition that in the United States engineers are marginalized. You'd have to, as I said, you have to look for pockets of imported old school European, maybe East Asian traditions of engineering as well. Not enough learning, too much practical stuff. But this is right on, and I wonder if in the United States it's the coexistence of these things that matters. I talk with our administration all the time that we try to sell the University of Pennsylvania as an old school East Coast elite rather than as a place of disruptive innovation, but they don't listen to me. So
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Voskuhl for her wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Just one quick reminder, she is, of course, giving the Science Pub tonight at the Camel. Doors open at 5:30. The event begins at 6. And I also, one final plug, there's some posters here for the STS series. There's one talk left. It is on Wednesday, April 6th, so far down the road, I guess. We are inviting Oliver Gakin, who's going to talk about the history of film, and his specific talk is about Thomas Edison. So if you're interested in that, check the STS website, come up here and grab a poster. Hope to see you there. Otherwise, Berglund people. Berglund people, come to the back. People who are in any of my classes, come to the front. Otherwise, have a good rest of the week.